And welcome back to another episode of the Magness and Marcus podcast on coaching. I'm Steve Magness, the coach of the University of Houston and author of, we'll go with the forthcoming book, Peak Performance. Joined by my partner in crime, John Marcus, coach of High Performance West. John, we're back again.
We're showing up. I made a promise. I said I'm going to show up. I'm hold Steve accountable to show up week in and week out, no matter how many cross-country flights he's on, getting his Cougars of University of Houston national qualifying marks. So
I will give you full credit because if you didn't show up, I probably never would.
That's true. That's why it's a symbiotic relationship that works.
little behind the scenes info for you listeners out there. John's the one who keeps us on target here with this podcast, and we are all thankful for that. So, speaking of difficult things to do, we're talking about the marathon this week, right? So we've had a couple requests from listeners to ask, hey, you guys talk about the track all the time. How about talk about, transitioning to the marathon and what the marathon entails? So that's what we're going to cover. So thanks, guys, for the input. Why don't we start here? What were some of the big misconceptions of the marathon that you had when you were starting out in coaching, which you don't have now?
I think the number one misconception I had was it's an extension of track and field pattern of training, just longer and harder, so to speak, in terms of all you do is you just turn up the volume of miles ran, and you also just turn up the volume of workouts that you run every week, and then decreasing, say, the paces. And the second thing is thinking that you have to do a lot of race pace specific work at marathon pace. Those two things, while they seem intoxicating and simple and correct, in my opinion and in my experience, are vitally wrong. Because it's, in a lot of ways, to me, it's very, it's seductive to think it's just that simple. And it really is not, because the marathon is a very tricky, difficult distance to prepare for a variety of reasons. And then on top of it, you have to get ready to compete against other people and the distance. So, those two things were paramount. And then the third was I grossly underestimated how quickly things can go south, how quickly fatigue can build up in an athlete. And in a matter of steps, essentially the light switch goes off. Essentially the fuel tank goes to empty. And you can't predict it, no matter how well you prepare, how well your fluid management is, how well your calorie, goo intake, whatever it is. It's almost like shooting darts in the dark from my experience. What about you, Steve?
Very similar in a lot of respects. But I would say maybe a couple to add to it or maybe expand on it is that you had to hit some certain number of big long runs or some certain number of big, like, marathon specific tempo runs or whatever in order to get there on race day. And I think the more I coach in the marathon and the marathoners is the wider variability I see of what works for people. And, the examples I like to give is I've seen Neely Spence do maybe 12 to 13 miles total at marathon pace, and that's about as far as she goes in training. And I've seen other athletes who go 18 miles, 19 miles at that pace and effort or faster and can do so in training. And I think the variation of what's needed for the marathon is so much greater than on the track for 10K, 5K, 1500, whatever have you. And I think the simple reason is if you look at all the track events, and I'm talking from, 1500 up, is the demands are all very, very similar. Like, yeah, they're a little bit different, right? I mean, the 1500, sure, a little more anaerobic, whatever. But it's very, very similar. Like, you just tweak things a little bit here and there, and you can run a good 15 or you can run a good 10K. But if you look at the marathon, the demands, it's almost like a different sport in a lot of ways. Because it's no longer training for like this one big limiter and then a couple other small limiters that might pop up on race day. It's like you have 10, 15 different like limiting factors for the marathon, and you don't know what one's going to show up on race day, right? So you might nail the fuel and all that, and they're perfect, but their legs or muscles might cramp and give out, right? And it's just, there's so many different iterations of that it's just tough to, it's not like you can train for every single one and check them all off.
Right. Yeah. It's not a bunch of physiological boxes or buckets to pay attention to, because even if you've done all that work and you've done it meticulously and you prepared deliberately and you've had no hiccups or anything, you get there on race day and there's still so much that can go wrong over the course of, 2 to 3 hours of being on your feet, pressing at like sub-maximal intensity for that duration that you just can't plan for. Like, do you get a blister? Do you, all of a sudden like have some type of intestinal issues? Do you grab the wrong water bottle that has a fluid concentration that really doesn't agree with you? I mean, is it crazy humid? Is it, insanely wet? Those are all things you can't control, and yet you have to be in that for 2 to 3 hours.
Exactly. I actually, Sarah Hall's first marathon ever was the perfect example of this, right? So her training was spot on. Like, I'm talking like didn't have a single bad workout during the, 3-month build or however long it was. Not a single bad workout. Everything went well. Like her other races went well. Everything was spot on. And then marathon day, it was like a disaster. I think she ran like 240 something. I don't even remember, right? It was just disaster. The only thing that happened was it was in LA and it was humid. And it was just horrible. 3 weeks later, she came back and was the top American and I think 20th at World Cross. So the fitness was there. But I remember being so shocked because literally, like, Sarah, Ryan, and I had just sat there and been like, this is not in the bag, but like, this has been the best buildup I've ever had with anybody. And Ryan sitting there saying, like, this is spot on. Like, this buildup has been incredible. And, here you go. You have America's fastest marathoner telling you that too. And you're like, all right, like, we're good. Like, I know stuff can happen, but maybe instead of 228, she runs 232, whatever, But then to see it all go down the tube in a couple miles in LA while I'm driving around was just it was a very big lesson to me to realize that while we control a good deal, the marathon is like the king. It controls,
without a doubt.
It controls everything.
I mean, you look at the women's Olympic trials last year. The order of placement at half marathon, number 1 through 5, was not the order of finish. You would not have bet, no one would have predicted that Shalane Flanagan would have suffered severe dehydration and cramps and have to basically, gimp in to 3rd place. Everyone would have been very hesitant to say Desi running her pace, running her race would have made that team. And that shows you, one of the things is like, I think we've said this before, those top 4 women last year were the same top 4 the previous 4 years with Kara Goucher, Amy Hastings, Shalane, and Desi. And that experiential knowledge, that awareness, that knowing they've been there many, many times before, and their depth of respect for the marathon and the level of preparation, and yet knowing all that does not mean anything, that they just got to the starting line, relatively healthy and relatively prepared, does not guarantee them the spot. And I think that is the difference between like an amateur and a professional mindset, is understanding that the distance, the task is the main thing to conquer. And you hear like Haile Gebrselassie talk about it. You hear other greats saying like, you're racing the distance. You're not racing the people. And it's, the reason why sometimes too, the way the race plays out, like say when Sammy Wanjerno in 2008 in Beijing just went crazy fast from the gun and just put the whole world on notice that no one thought he was going to do it. It was a suicide mission. And it was either going to work out brilliantly, which it did, or it was going to fail miserably. There was but he made a decision to say, at least I'm going to give it a go and do it this way. And we'll see what happens. But you see that all the time, right? How often has the world record holder in that event won the race at a major championship, at an Olympic or at a world championship in recent modern times? Very rarely, right?
Right. Yeah.
Yet the world record holder, more often than not, in the track events will win that track event, provided they are healthy. If they've set that world record within recent years, or even that year. So that's one of the big differences, is there's a lot more direct transfer of how you're performing and how you're doing in track events, and it's a little bit more predictable versus the marathon. And I think that's a cautionary tale. Now, how do you prepare for it? Like, yes, you still do all the right things. You still put in all the big buckets, and you still go out and put in the hard miles, not discounting that. But you also have to train the mind during it as well, because that's going to be critical, because how you respond to that adversity and that those moments you can't prepare for, it's more you're training, how do I respond to uncertainty, rather than how do I prepare for this plan. And the athletes I found who have succeeded and thrived in a marathon setting, making a transition from the track, those are people who can operate very well and have a very true compass about their ability to rebound and respond in trying adverse, unpredictable moments.
Yeah, no, that's the mental component is much bigger, because you have 2 hours, 2.5 hours in your own head. And I think what happens a lot of times is like that's your coping mechanisms are put to the test. And as a coach or as a runner, what you really need to learn is to know what kind of runner you are, and where you're going to go when the time is dark, right? When the things get a little hazy and hairy and all that good stuff and uncertain, is where do you go, and learning how to combat that. And when I look at the marathon specifically with race plans, for instance, I always look at what kind of runner do I have? Do I have someone, for instance, Neely, who's a very, very patient runner who is capable of running almost the whole thing by herself, if that means like running her kind of race and within her splits? Or with Sarah, it's the exact opposite. Like, she needs to be running with or after someone. She doesn't do well in the kind of run your own thing, and it just isn't her running personality. So not only does that like shape the race plan, but it also shapes the training a bit too. So I think taking into consideration what you have as an athlete, and like how to mold that to best get you through that marathon distance in the fastest time or best way you could race is something that everyone needs to consider, much more so than if we were on the track racing a 5K.
Right. Personality is key. in marathoning, because you can be very successful being very OCD and wedded to your watch and running a very prescriptive pace throughout, because it lends to itself over the long haul. If you keep that pace, if you're efficient, you will have an opportunity to be successful because you're steady Eddie. Also, we've seen in Boston and other major championships and major road races, this erratic miles thrown in, in the men. I remember Hendrik Romala in New York a decade ago throws in a 420 mile, mile 16, just crazy surging. And you go, whoa, what? But that's because that's a strategy that he's prepared to execute on to try to shake people in the race. Because we know too with the marathon is if you can endure to mile 23, 24, and then the field starts to break up, the field starts to whittle, then you only have to worry about battling it out against the next couple of miles to finish it out, but also only a couple people. And I think, the main thing I'm trying to get athletes to wrap their head around when they're transitioning from the track to the marathon is you have to be so battle hardened or robust or anti-fragile in your mindset. And then you have to prepare to be so, not just physically, mentally, emotionally, like this. It's a complete preparedness. And I think it's a misnomer that the marathon has become such a popular event in the second running boom, because that really is what spurred it. It's like everybody can run a marathon. You can run a marathon, you can run a marathon, everyone can run a marathon. And that's great. Yes, everyone can walk a marathon. Sure, that's fine. But we're talking about making this transition from hard racing on the track to hard racing over 2 to 3 hours. And that's not for everybody. And it takes a long, long time to prepare to do it well consistently. I mean, how many athletes have had that one pop-off marathon? And it's like, whoa, that's amazing. And yet they haven't been able to come back and be consistent over the long haul. And consistency is not every marathon you run is successful. Consistency is being able to get up on the horse again and again and again after failing, and yet being able to put the pieces back together. Like Meb Keflezighi, great example. Like Desi, great example. They've had highs and they've had, the highest highs and the lowest lows, but they keep getting back on the horse, and they know how to do that. And that, I think, too, is a lot of athletes beat themselves up after a marathon. Result doesn't go well. They drop out or they get sick because, you invest 6 months of time, effort, energy, and training. It's like this project that you're doing. And then you take this project or the small business to market and no one likes it and it fails. And you're like, oh. And it's just, it's this dejection where you're like, no, get back on the horse, keep putting in the hard miles, because look at these other greats who have had as many failures, like Bekele, Gebrselassie, Paul Turgot. I mean, I can go down the list of who we consider the greatest marathoners who had crappy marathons and had to DNF, dropped out, or got whooped.
Yeah, no, that's a great point. And I think what happens a lot of times is athletes almost, maybe not, this isn't the right word, but they almost feel entitled to running well because they hunkered down and put in the 6 months of work for this one race, right? And it's almost like, well, I deserve to run well because I dedicated everything to this race. And it's frustrating for them because if it doesn't go well, then it's not like a 5K where you say, okay, I'm going to rebound and run, another one in 2 or 3 weeks and I'll be okay. It's very final. There's a finality to the marathon saying this is it. This is all that work went into this, whether it's good or bad. And I have to accept what happens and move forward and move on. And as you said, the good ones are good because they're really good at getting what am I trying to say? When the stress, they're good at turning the stress off, I guess. They're good, if you look at a stress response, they're very good at coming down off of it. And it's the same with racing, is the good ones are good at coming down off of good races and off of bad races. And saying, okay, what is next? What's going to happen? and like just almost like reframing things to make sure that they got something out of it and move forward, and that's a skill that needs to be developed, because in the track world, a lot of times when you're looking at middle distance or long distances, you develop this skill of almost like aggressiveness towards racing. Like, oh, okay, I'm going to get in my time trial race. I have to my time. I got to get my qualifier to the Olympics or Olympic trials or whatever you. So it's all aggression. And I think the marathon generally requires a different kind of personality take.
And it requires a lot of repetition of doing the art, doing the distance, like running the race, like multiple times. Because I once, talked to a couple elite marathoners, and they said, it really takes about 5 or 6 marathons before you know what you're doing, before you even get a grasp on it. And these are high level people who've been racing at a high level on the track and on the road for half marathon and shorter for 10, 15 years.
Well,
and here they are being like, I got to start from square one.
Yeah. And I mean, think of it in terms of racing any other distance, right? When you start in high school, like how many times does it take you to just figure out the mile before you start going like, oh, I'm going to go out in 65 and then run 5 minutes for the mile, right? You see that all the time, even with college kids. It takes them several races before we kind of are able to hone in and figure out, all right, like stop being an idiot. This is how you run these races roughly. And the marathon is you have so few chances, and there's so many things that kind of switch, where some feel really good for a while, some you go through some really rough patches, and it's like figuring out how to deal with those. So what I found is that the really good marathoners have a good idea of self-awareness. So Desi's a great example, but they know on that day what their capabilities are, right? And they're able to find and ride that line for as long as they can. And I think that the inexperienced sometimes either over or underestimate their capabilities because they don't have that self-awareness to know, like, all right, where's the line today? No, not the line based on what my training indicates, but the line based on where can I run today? And I think that's a skill that you have to develop over several marathons to figure out.
Yeah, marathon racing is a very sophisticated practice. It's sophisticated in its preparation, and it's very sophisticated in its execution. A lot of people are like, oh, just give me the, quick hits about how to prepare. For me, those quick hits are, you have to get comfortable with a long, steady discomfort. That's not the discomfort of just like, being in a slight oxygen jet, or, you're having your lactate or acidosis levels creeping up. Like, not that grind. Like, yeah, that's important. That's part of the craft. But it's also just discomfort with, okay, hey, I'm a little colder than I should be. I'm a little hotter than I should be. Or, oh, I'm wearing 2 socks that are like calf socks, and one sock fell, or one sock kind of inched down to the ankle. So things are off. Things aren't perfect. Things are a little bit, helter-skelter. It's those people who are okay in that environment and not letting it be a distractor and detract from what they're doing in the moment who will be successful. 2, it's like you got to put in the hard miles. And the hard miles are not necessarily running fast and running these ridiculous paces. It's, it's a time on the feet thing. And so regularly you need to go a little bit further than what your race time is. So if you're shooting for a 2.5-hour marathon, your long runs, you should have a couple that are like 3 hours, because you want to know you can, maybe you don't cover 26 miles in that 3 hours, maybe you cover 25, 24. But you can run for that time. Because also, too, we think a lot about, I can run for the mileage. And my favorite is, the classic, I did 18 miles at marathon pace, I'm ready to go. And it's like, that is the worst workout ever from a hubristic standpoint, because that doesn't mean anything. I mean, if you've been a college runner, you can do 18 miles because that's basically everyone's long run for 4 years, the Division I level. Everyone's running 2 hours. Everyone's running 18 miles. So saying I could do it at marathon pace, I'm ready to go. Yeah, maybe it is, but 9 times out of 10, it doesn't mean anything. It's an incomplete measure. And so I encourage people to think a little bit more deeply, turn the lights on, and think what really are the obstacles here. And it's time on the feet, negotiating the fatigue and the cumulative fatigue as it sets in. And while it's not an easy pill to swallow for a lot of people, the reality is our understanding and our competitiveness with the marathon is elevating. It's not what it was in the 90s. Sure is not what it was in the 80s. And even in the early 2000s, when you could just roll, a lot of these guys and gals could roll off the track and basically do a hard long run as a marathon and get a qualifying mark to something, because it was in its infancy in our understanding. Now the speed of play at the elite level and even like the amateur level to qualify Olympic trials, the bar is raised, and it's raised a lot higher than it was. And you have to respect the difficulty that takes. And so it's okay to train for 6 months and fail miserably 2 or 3 times. That's fine. I mean, I know people, that's their career, that's their job, and they will train 2 years and it never connects. And then finally it connects. But now does that mean they know how to make it connect every time down the road? No, because I don't believe much correlation between having a fast debut marathon or a successful one, or having an unsuccessful debut marathon, and then what your result will be in the next one. Because we get all excited all the time. Like, oh, this person, they ran a crazy fast debut. They're the next. They're going to be. Well, ask Ryan Hall how that, look at his career trajectory. I mean, I think it's very successful. He ran very fast. He made Olympic teams. He was a player. He put himself in the mix, and he pushed himself to be one of the best, and regardless of what what your opinion is of his career or not, he gave it everything he had. And that to me is something to champion and something to be excited about, versus, look at other athletes who come off an Olympic year and say, oh man, I just made an Olympic team. Okay, I'm going to train for a fall marathon. And there was all this hype and this, they're going to debut. It's going to be great. They had a great track season. And then the debut is just, something not to remember. I mean, it happens very frequently. It's not because the intelligent coach and the capable athlete didn't train well and train appropriately. It's just that's how difficult the darn thing is.
And I think that goes to maybe the whole point of this podcast is you need some humility when you approach the marathon, right? And it's easy to say it. It's easy to say, oh, I'm humble. Like the marathon's this, and this. But no, you really do. Because I think a lot of times we, as coaches and as athletes, we make that mistake. And that's why you see some of those debuts coming off track training is sometimes people nail it. But sometimes, people fold and have a horrible debut. And I think it's a common thing to say, respect the distance, but you really, truly need to. And more than that, you really need to understand that if the first one doesn't go well, like you said, it's not the end of the world, right? How many times did we see, athletes like Paul Tergat or whoever, Gilbert Selassie maybe even, not reach this epic stardom in their debut marathon that they were all supposed to do based on their incredible track careers. It happens. And if it happens to the best of the best, then it can happen to any Joe Schmo off the street. And I think what you have to do as a coach or as an athlete is to try and give yourself the best chance to succeed in a way that isn't like, oh, I'm going to run, if I'm a woman, I'm going to debut in 2:29. Like, that's not what it's about. You need to take the long view and say, okay, we're going to get one in. We're going to do the best we can. We're going to learn how to run this thing and, use this as building blocks towards mastering this distance. And I think that needs to be taken into consideration. And I think part of that, too, is taking into consideration what marathon you run. Because, again, some challenge different things. If we run Boston, you better get good at running downhill. If you run New York, you better be really, really strong to be able to run through the hills in the last couple miles because they hit you really hard. If you're running a fast marathon, fast flat course, that changes the dynamics too. Same with one that could be potentially hot, humid, whatever have you. But the dynamics and the limiting factors change a lot. And I think as a coach, you want to make sure that you're setting your athlete up for getting what you want out of the marathon versus like having this horrible experience, which I think sometimes happens. And then the good ones bounce back, like we said, but sometimes what you see is almost like a PTSD with it, right? And it's like, and it gets like mental in their head. Now, I don't know if this happened or not, but look at the world record holder in the half marathon, the men's half marathon, Tedeschi, right? He's run, I don't know, what's the men's half record? 58 something?
He's pretty fast. Yes.
Yeah, he's killed it. But his fastest marathon is like 2:12 maybe, right? Which is not comparable at all. And he's taken, 4 or 5 tries, I think, now. But I think that's what we have to remember is like, you got to do the best you can to set yourself up and then set yourself up mentally so that you don't have this like, lingering scar that can affect you for a while.
And this is nothing new. I mean, look at Boston Billy, Bill Rogers. He had many, many a bad marathon in his prime, when he was the king of the marathon. But that's the thing. I think what lends to when an athlete really is ready to transition from track racing, cross country racing to marathon racing, or even road racing to marathon racing, is do they love putting in the miles? Because that's one of the big things. You have to be so in love with the process. You're going to put so many, footsteps in front of the other to get ready for the marathon, that if you do not have this just inherent love about being there on the pavement, pounding away, the morning run, the evening run, the doubles, if that doesn't fill you with joy, then, and if you're only doing it because you're going to get a big appearance fee or there's big prize money, or you think, this is always my favorite, it's an easier team to make, is a marathon team. It's easy. It's like, nothing's easy about any team at any level in the United States in track and field and road racing. So, because again, it's less certain, yes, but as you saw, like last year with the Olympic trials, I mean, the people who were in position to make that team and who made the team were either very capable athletes who have been there before, athletes who have trained very hard for a long time at a very high level, and people who had a long lineage of credentials proceeding from high school almost all the way up through college and to post-collegiate world. So, because I think there's, in my opinion, a lot of people think it's easy to train for the marathon. It's just more like we said before, it's more miles. You do 2 workouts a week and you make them longer, and you do a long run. And you just make the long run longer. And then you just make your recovery runs longer as well, so you get more mileage, and then you're ready to run the marathon. And I wish it was that simple, because if it was, man, everyone would be crushing. But that's the thing that, that's the great lie that the amateurs or the hobby joggers or the recreational coaches and athletes kind of glossed over or, are telling themselves, because they're not really committing to like how hard and how difficult this thing is to do it well. And anytime you're talking about doing something well, it's a difficult proposition and venture.
And I think that's where individuality plays a huge factor in marathon training. And I think even more so than any of the shorter stuff, because like you need to learn how, and you need to be responsive to how long it takes athletes to come off of different types of workouts and adapt to them. Because I think that varies very, very greatly. Some can do long marathon pace work or long tempo work and come back fine and be good and keep hammering along. Well, some it might take them 3 or 4 days to just kind of bounce back off of it. And I think one of the key lessons, takeaways I've gotten is you got to get out of this like typical week cycle that you're in the track world, right? 2 days or 2 hard workouts, as you said, in the long run. Like sometimes you have to, maybe it's just expand that to 8-day cycle or 9 or 10-day cycle or something to that degree. But giving yourself space to get things in and bounce around to different stimuli is paramount. You know, I found it with, for instance, one of my athletes, Sarah Crouch, who was top 10 at Chicago. She takes about 3 relatively easy days in between any kind of quality work she does. And that's just what has happened in the marathon training that she does. It's how she best responds while getting in the mileage that she needs to and all that stuff. So her planning schedule isn't on any kind of cycle whatsoever. There's not like a Sunday long run or a Saturday long run or a Monday long run. The long run just kind of comes when it comes. And I think getting out of that set standard cycle is something that you need to do as a marathon coach.
Yes, good marathon coaching is an N of 1. It's highly individualized and tailored. And you see that all the time. Like, you know, Desi, her training is an N of 1 in the Hanson's group. Bob Larson, N of 1 with Kafletsky. You know, even when Kara and Shalane trade together under Jerry, and even Amy Hastings, or Amy Craig now, training with Schumacher, it's still an N of 1 for each one of those women. And I mean, that is the reality. Is there's sure a template that you can go off of, but you have to know yourself as a person and as an athlete, and your coach has to know you really well. And the other thing I want to interject is, too, you have a lot of worry and a lot of insecurity about racing the marathon because it's this big opaque unknown. But I remember talking to Jerry Schumacher after the Olympic trials, and he was like, well, I was like, were you worried? He goes, oh no, because what he calls fear of God workouts. So he had these fear of God workouts, which were much more difficult asks to do that the women he was training for the marathon had to accomplish before the marathon trials. And once they passed that test, they knew, okay, this is going to be much more difficult, this workout or these series of workouts, than anything I'm going to meet come race day, no matter what. And so then they went in with this confidence that they could accomplish and they could achieve, rather than a lot of times we look to training as a reassurance in terms of every workout, you're just trying to reassure yourself that you can do it, that you can reach your goal. Like, okay, this workout's a little better. It's a little faster. It felt a little easier. My perception was, not quite as difficult. Okay, I'm progressing. Okay, good. I'm reassuring, because your confidence really is not there versus being like, hey, in a marathon, you don't get a lot of time. You don't get a lot of, rust buster marathons before your big one. I mean, you just can't do it. So you have to create these workout situations where you're going to do something, whether it's within 1 day or back-to-back days, or 2 days and 3 days, 2 sessions in 3 days, whatever, where it's going to be a much more difficult ask. And you do that a couple times so that you play and you dance with the tension. You dance with that fear about the unknown that's going to be confronted with you. And so then when you meet it on race day, you're like, oh, it's not as bad as I had thought. It's not as bad as that workout. And then that gives you that positive emotional energy. So the mental component is so great in a marathon, especially as you get more cognitively fatigued, as everything in your body gets fatigued. Your brain is not going to be able to see as clear. And I think the good athletes, the ones that we think are always on their games, they love that moment when the mind gets cloudy, because that's an opportunity for them to clear the fog that their body is saying, hey, please stop, slow down by all means. But they clear their mind, and it truly is clearing the mind in the way they talk about it. And they just focus on manageable chunks very clearly and concisely. And then all of a sudden it looks to the outside observer, they're walking away or sprinting away from the pack or the competition, but they're so clear about the next 10 steps, and they just make that affirmation, 10 steps, then another 10 steps, or light post to light post, or street to street. But because that clarity is there at the moment of high toxicity, they're able to accomplish it and make it look effortless. I mean, as author of this upcoming performance book, Steve, what, and being an expert now on this, because you've written this totem of this book, how does that resonate, or is that contrary to what you've experienced in your and Brad's research?
I love the plug there. And by the way, we do cover this topic. No, it's funny. You were sitting there talking about it, and it resonates completely. And actually, our good friend Phoebe Wright kind of summed it up. And this has always stuck with me. Is she calls it zooming in. Like you zoom so far in where it's like, okay, get to the next light post. And I've talked about him before, but I had a conversation, a sit down with a drummer friend who is a drummer for probably the biggest artist in the world. And when he's struggling up there, he's like, all right, like when I'm struggling and I'm like grinding through it and I'm like really pressing instead of being in this like flow state type deal that we all wish and imagine, he just breaks it down. And he's like, I literally go like one action at the time. Like, what is my action? Oh, hit this. Okay, what is my next action? This. I'm not thinking, 5 lines, 5 seconds, 10 seconds ahead. I am literally like, what is my next step? And I just do that. He was telling me he just does that until he gets back to where he can kind of take the pressure off a little bit and get back into that rhythm of it, where now he's kind of has that ability to do that. And I think all great performers, and that's one of the things we learned from this book, is all great performers do that. And you have to have that capacity, that capability during the rough spots to zoom all the way in and focus on, okay, what do I have to do in this second, in this moment, right now to move ahead? And I think what you see with people who aren't quite seasoned or haven't developed that skill yet is instead of being able to break it down to that, what happens is they have this like panic freak out moment. And they sit there and they say, okay, like, oh my God, I'm at mile 23 and I have 3 more miles and it feels like I can't take another step. So I'm just going to give in, slow down, and crater, instead of breaking it down to this next, as simple as it can be. And you see the same thing in the mile splits where people are saying, oh, I need to run 540 mile. And what happens if I run a 550 mile? Well, the seasoned veteran thinks like, okay, I'm all right. Like, let's just try and keep it rolling, like focus on the next 400 meters and maybe pressing it down a little bit. Well, the unseasoned vet kind of freaks out and either tries to make a big move to catch up, right? To get rid of that money he has extracted and makes a mistake. Or he goes into this like catastrophizing where he just lets his mind run rampant and starts ruminating. And that 550 mile now turns into 630 next mile when he could have probably kept it 550 to 6 minutes and, salvaged it until he felt better. And I think what happens with athletes or with everybody is when they're going through the rough patch, they imagine that it's going to happen for the rest of the race. And that freaks them out. And they don't have this experience, this understanding to say, in this moment, I am hurting or I am suffering or it is becoming more difficult. What is my coping strategy to make my way through this for as long as I need to, because I might come out of this either in the next minute or maybe 5 minutes down the line, but I can come out of this and knowing that it's not lasting through the rest of the race.
And that preparation is 50-50, just as important as putting in the miles and the hard miles. Because if you're just mindlessly listening to your jock jams, putting in the miles and thinking, oh, I'm going to be ready to go, but yet you don't have those kind of come to Jesus moments in workouts, long runs, where you're holding yourself accountable, where you're like dancing again with that tension, with that fear, then you're doing yourself a disservice by all the time and energy you're investing in this training and this preparation of the physical without wetting and practicing and enhancing the mental. And that to me is one of the key transitions, because you can get away with just physical preparation on the track and even shorter road races, because the duration of the suffering and discomfort and severity of it is not as long. But you can't hide in the marathon, and you can't hide emotionally or mentally in the marathon. And if you don't do that work before that marathon, but you do the perfect physical work, it will get exposed, guaranteed. And so that's what makes transitioning and training for the marathon from the track so tricky, even for the most skilled and competent athlete and successful athlete around the oval.
Yeah, and you have to, and that's what makes marathon training is you have to embrace like the difficulties and the uncertainty and just the grind of it all. If you do that, like you don't wait for the perfect day to hit your workout, right? You don't run it on the perfect flat course to get it done. You have to put yourself in situations where, it kind of sucks. And you're going to go through this mental, downtime roadblock where you got to figure your way out of it. That's why you also shouldn't always have, some training partner pacing you the whole time or something like that. Like, you've got to get through those mentally difficult times and use those as almost rehearsal points for where you're going to go in the race. Because I think the mistake a lot of people make is that they see the physical training and getting physically ready, but training in practice is also mental conditioning. And where you go in practice is where you're going to go in the race. So if you, like you said, wear your iPod or whatever, turn on your music, or like rely on someone else pacing you and you just latching on and going for a ride, you're training yourself mentally in an entirely different way than what will likely happen, which is at some point in the marathon, you're going to be in no man's land and hammering away with, someone 100 meters up on you and someone 100 meters down on you, and you just trying to figure it out. And I think a lot of times that athletes don't have those points when it's just them alone in their head in practice, and that can make a difference.
Yeah, so there's a lot of things Stephen have gone over today where it shows you it's just marathon training is not an extension. It's a whole nother ball of wax. Or I should say effective, comprehensive, intelligent marathon training is not an extension of track training. And while it's seductive to want to think that and, implement that, the reality is you're just doing yourself a disservice and you're legitimately going through the motions if you do that. And it's like if you're going to give a chunk of your life, 6 months, a year, however long, over to this preparation, to me, you want to make sure you do it well. And to me, I think it's important to sit down and be very deliberate and consider those elements and the influence they have. There's enough tips and tricks out there for those seeking about fluid management and things regarding how many calories to take in, drinking early and often, drinking every 5 kilometers, all those types of things. Sure, like those are good best practices to know, but again, they will be ineffective if these foundational elements, apart from the physical preparation, the mental and emotional and responsiveness training, is not part of your wheelhouse or your tool chest in getting prepared.
Exactly. I couldn't have summed it up any better. You're getting good at this, John. But,
with practice, right? This is deliberate practice. So.
There we go. And I think, I know a lot of people sometimes want bunches of training details and stuff like that. Maybe we'll have a podcast on marathon nuts and bolts training one day, once we run out of topics. But I think the message when we considered, okay, someone wants us to talk about the marathon, is we're not gurus on training for any one distance, right? We're just kind of coaches, and what really matters to me is, and John, is getting the message across that doesn't always get conveyed. And that's why we started this podcast, is to get that message across. And the training details, I've talked about them. John's talked about them. There's coaches who are way smarter than us who have gone over the marathon, but it's really this in and outs of the psychology, the uncertainty, the difficulty of it all that doesn't really get addressed that much. So hopefully our little spiel on that kind of starts that conversation and gets you to start asking, where are you training mentally and psychologically as well as physically? And are you setting yourself up for success for the marathon in that direction? Because it's going to have just about as big of an impact as if you've been doing, all the long runs, all the training, all the marathon specific work.
And that is the difficult work. It's not the natural, fluidity and clarity and joy of putting one foot in front of the other. But that difficult work, that has a payoff, and that's what makes it a shallow, superficial practice to a practice with more depth and dimension. And if that is the case, it's a strengthened practice that will serve you well in those moments of doubt, in those moments of uncertainty. And I always tell people, you can be very superficial and react to the moment. And the idea, right, is when you react to something, that's bad, as if you're in the doctor's office, or if your reaction to the drug, that means something bad happened. But if you respond well, if you respond to the medicine, if you're responding to what's in front of you, that's a good thing. And so you want to shift that mindset to a responsive mindset. How do I create a solution? Not let me react and judge and freak out and put all some negative emotion and energy into it. And that's what catches a lot of people off guard. But it's difficult work. But I think, using running and marathon training as a conduit, and running and track training, and how Steve and I, our preferred message of coaching is it's worth showing up, not hiding, and doing that difficult work, because you're going to get a lot out of it. And I've seen it so many times with so many people. I can preach it because I've watched it unfold again and again and again, and it's worth it. It's hard, but it's worth it.
Preach on. Well, once again, thanks everyone for listening. We appreciate all the feedback. You can continue to hit us up on social, on Twitter. Check out my blog at Science of Running, where these things are posted. It'll have John and myself's Twitter handles in case you didn't know what those were. But appreciate everybody listening. And
starting the plugs for Steve's book. Again, he's not going to plug it all that much himself right now. But I can tell you I've read it, and it is valuable, vulnerable work. He and his co-author, Brad, put a lot of time and energy into it. And, if all the stuff we've been talking about for the last 2 years has piqued your interest, it is worth the purchase. And I don't put that lightly, because I'm not here to sell books. But again, bringing a book to market is a difficult task. It's like, giving birth to and raising a child. So check it out when it comes out, because I think you'll learn about 10 to 14 things. And if you don't, shoot me an email or hit me up on Twitter, and I'll reimburse you for it, the book.
Oh, look at that. Thank you, John.
You're welcome, buddy.
You're good at this stuff. Awesome. Well, thanks again for listening, everybody. We'll be back on the regular, thanks to John, not myself.
Hey, because we're here to give the people what they want.
That is.
Thank you. We appreciate it.